Modern Horizons 3 is here, and the modern format is about to be turned upside down. The newest set in the Modern Horizons lineage does not disappoint, introducing a slew of powerful additions to the format, including new Eldrazi, a cycle of free spells, flip planeswalkers, new to modern reprints, and many more. Rather than spending the next 3 hours talking about every card in the set, we're going to focus on a few select cards that have significant implications for my favorite modern archetype, Black-Green Yawgmoth. This set will have a huge impact on the Yawgmoth archetype, as there's almost a dozen cards that could potentially slot into the deck. And it's important to note, this set is a little different from other Modern Horizons sets in that many of the most powerful cards have significant deck building restrictions. So when we're evaluating these cards, assessing them in a vacuum is faulty. We need to look at them in the context of what they do and what implications they will have on deck construction. In my opinion, there is no way to make all of these options work together. But let's take it from the top and start with some powerful mythic rares. The first mythic rare I want to talk about is the one I am the most excited about, not because it's necessarily the best, but because the implications it can have for this deck could be enormous. In fact, it could just completely change the way the deck is built because of how powerful a card this seems to be. I'm talking about Birthing Ritual. Birthing Ritual is an ode to Birthing Pod, which was a powerful combo enabler in Modern that eventually got banned because it was too degenerate. This card is a slightly more tame version of Birthing Pod that can be a powerful engine for toolboxy based creature strategies that could prove to be one of the most important cards for Yawgmoth in the set. This enchantment allows you to dig for specific threats or answers depending on the game state, so it serves a similar role to the other creature tutors that are in the deck, specifically Court of Calling and previously Eldritch Evolution. On the downside, this card does make the deck more susceptible to artifact and enchantment hate post-sideboard. Cards like Pick Your Poison, Force of Vigor, Haywire Might will have more targets now that this is an option within the deck. The good things about this card is that there's no commitment to sacrifice a creature until you see what cards are available for you to take, which is a huge upside for the card in my opinion. Also, it triggers at end of turn, which in my opinion is a good and a bad thing. This means that the turn Birthing Ritual comes into play, most of the time you will get value off this card before your opponent interacts with it. The downside is that it's kind of awkward with Grist the Hunger Tide, which you can get off Birthing Ritual because it's a creature in your deck. The only problem is because this is happening end of turn, you won't be able to activate Grist until your next turn, which means your opponent can attack into it or can just bolt it down before you have the chance to move up to 4 loyalty. As I alluded to in the intro to today's video, this card requires significant build around to make it work. You need ample creatures in your deck at mana values 1 through 3 to ensure that you have options to get off this card every turn. Yawgmoth already contains plenty of 1 and 2 drop creatures, but the 3 drop slot is what I view to be a little bit of a void that needs to be filled to ensure that you can chain this card into a Yawgmoth eventually. This could be an avenue to potentially get Geralf's Messenger back into the deck, which is a powerful tool to have access to, but creates a significant strain on the mana base, which is going to be a common theme you're going to hear throughout today's video. The card I like the most, or that I think gains the most from the inclusion of Birthing Ritual, is Honest Rutstein, which is a 3-drop that, when it comes into play, triggers and you can get the 2-drop that you just sacrificed back into your hand. So a common line of play that I foresee happening is sacrifice an Orcish Bowmaster, get in Rutstein, and then pay the discounted rate for your Bowmaster to flash it in once more. It's a lot of value with not a lot of drawback. Birthing Ritual incentivizes you to utilize cards that either generate tokens or have Undying. Young Wolf, which is the cornerstone Undying creature for this deck, is a shoo-in. The cost to run it at 1 mana is very minimal. The tension associated with this card arises at the 2-drop slot with Strangleroot Geist. This card in particular, Geist, is going to be one of the biggest considerations for how Yawgmoth decks are going to be built post Modern Horizons 3, as you're going to continue to hear and see over and over again in today's video. I think that overall Birthing Ritual is an incredibly powerful card that is either going to be super busted or just a little too slow and a little too cute for the modern format. It almost has shades of Fiend Artisan in a sense, so we'll see which end of the spectrum it falls on. I could see anywhere from 0 to 4 copies of this card in the deck. My best guess right now is probably 2 to 3 copies. Grist, Voracious Larva, Grist the Plague Swarm. This card is very exciting, obviously not so much for its front side, but the potential to flip it and play with another Grist Planeswalker ahead of curve. The key ways to flip this card include Yawgmoth sacrificing an undying creature, Flare of Cultivation, which we're going to talk about momentarily, Birthing Ritual, which you just heard me talk about, a Grist -2 sacrificing an undying creature, and we're talking about other Grist, having an undying creature either block or attack and die in combat, and then you Chord of Calling for Grist Voracious Larva in response, or you could even just Bowmaster one of your own undying creatures to kill it, trigger undying, and be able to flip your Grist. So sticking to a theme, this card incentivizes you to build your deck with a significant number of undying creatures and ways to sacrifice them. So it works really well with Birthing Ritual, and much like Birthing Ritual, you want a lot of undying creatures. The biggest question mark with this card, once again, is Strangleroot Geist. It creates a significant strain on your mana early in the game, but you want to play a significant number of undying creatures. The floor on this card is nothing exciting, but it could be a fine tutor target to act as a removal spell for a big attacking creature, something like a Territorial Kavu. You can Chord for 1, block it, and remove the Kavu from the board. The upside on this card is very high if you're able to flip it. It provides another answer to Cursed Totem, Pithing Needle, and other problematic artifacts and enchantments. It's a great value engine, much like the original Grist, and it works very well with Yawgmoth, Cauldron, and Birthing Ritual, as I've mentioned a few times. This flip version is very similar in its effects to the original Grist the Hunger Tide once you get to the backside, but the need to jump through hoops to produce a similar threat might not be worth the work. Of note though, this is another insect for the original Grist to be able to mill to trigger an additional time. With this card in particular, I foresee 0 to 1 copies making the cut in the deck. Eladamri, Korvecdal. When I first saw this card, I got very excited. It is a very powerful value creature all on its own. It does not need anything else in play to be able to function and produce value. This card has shades of one of my favorite cards that I've played up to this point in Yawgmoth, and that is Elven Chorus. Being able to play creatures off the top of your deck has great synergy with a lot of the creatures and other cards in our deck. Particularly Yawgmoth, you get to essentially choose what's on top of your deck by continuing to draw cards. Same thing with Grist. If you have a non-creature on top of your deck, you can uptick the Grist, put it into the graveyard to hopefully find a creature underneath and play with Eladamri. Fetch lands, you don't have a creature on top, you can fetch it away to find a creature on top, and same thing with Surveil lands, fixing the top of your library. All of these synergies make it so you can not necessarily ensure that you're getting value off of the Eladamri, but increase the chances that you're getting value off of this card. The downside is that this is a creature rather than an enchantment like Elven Chorus, and as a result, it is much easier to remove and less reliable as a result. The role I see this card filling within the deck is as a value engine that you would probably Chord of Calling for in top deck battles in the mid to late game against other grindy strategies. Typically in these instances in the past, you would Chord for a Grist, which you would hope would stick around, produce some insects, and then eventually you would be able to -5 and kill your opponent. This might be a little bit better in those situations to be able to create an insurmountable advantage if you can get a couple of creatures off the top of the library. Eladamri's second ability feels like a little bit of an afterthought to me. It will be used, but it's not the primary reason to run this card. Of note, you can put it under Agatha's Soul Cauldron to be able to activate its activated ability with the Cauldron, but you're not going to get as much value off of the activated ability as you would having it in play, being able to cast creatures off the top. Of note, if you do put this ability on another creature with Cauldron, you can't look at the top card of your library, but you can still try to cast creatures off of the top. So it will be kind of a shot in the blind whether or not you actually reveal a creature off the top to be able to put it into play. This to me seems like a worthwhile card to play in the 75 as a one of tutor target to find in those grindy late game situations where you and your opponents are top decking. I foresee one copy in the 75. Phyrexian Tower. This card has probably produced the most hype and excitement within the Yawgmoth community, but I think some of that hype is a little misguided. Let me explain. This card has a very unique effect. The ability to produce 2 mana off a single land is a powerful asset for any deck to have access to. This can let you ramp into Grist or Yawgmoth ahead of curve as early as turn 2, and it plays very nicely with Yawgmoth's Proliferate ability as well, being able to sacrifice a creature, add the 2 black mana necessary to proliferate with Yawg. Further, as I alluded to with Birthing Ritual, if Geralf's Messenger makes it back in the deck, and we need to hardcast Geralf's Messenger, having access to a land that can produce double black mana can make that significantly easier. But much like many of the other inclusions from Modern Horizons 3, this card incentivizes you to build a deck with a large number of Undying creatures and creature tokens to utilize for the sacrifice cost. These creatures would be something like Yawgmoth, Orcish Bowmasters, Grist the Hungertide, and the belle of the ball, Strangleroot Geist. Once again, there is a significant tension between Strangleroot Geist and this card. Since adding Delighted Halfling to the deck, the double green CMC on Strangleroot Geist has become harder to manage. You're not going to have as many mana creatures to be able to power out that Geist and another spell on turn 2 as we had previously. So it's important that most of your lands produce green mana to be able to consistently produce a Strangleroot Geist on turn 2, assuming we're running some number of copies of the card. As you've heard me say, all of these new cards are rewarding you for playing more Undying creatures. So is running a land that only produces colorless or black mana going to be feasible if we have some number of Strangleroot Geist in the deck? Additionally, if this winds up being the case, where there are 2 or more Strangleroot Geists in the list, I don't know that we are going to be able to reliably play Phyrexian Tower and have it produce the value that we want it to, because I think it's going to get in the way more than it's going to help. If we play just Flare of Cultivation in the list and no Birthing Ritual, I think Phyrexian Tower will likely make the cut. But if it is Birthing Ritual and Flare of Cultivation, I don't foresee Tower making the cut. I think there will be 0 to 1 copies of this card in decks moving forward. Now, let's move on to the rares. Flare of Cultivation. So, as you all know, free spells are notoriously broken in Magic the Gathering. We had the free spell cycle in Modern Horizons 1, we had the free spell cycle in Modern Horizons 2, and now we have a free spell cycle in Modern Horizons 3, and this flare, in my opinion, is as strong, if not stronger, than any of the other free spells in this set. This card feels incredible and very busted alongside Young Wolf. The ability to play Young Wolf out on turn 1 and ramp your mana with little to no drawback is completely busted. This is also fine to use to sacrifice a mana creature or a Dryad Arbor just to ensure that your mana production will be consistent for the rest of the game. But much like many other cards in the set, there is a significant deck building cost. You have to play more basic lands to get value off of this card, especially if there are multiple copies. I think the minimum number of basic lands I would be considering running with multiple copies of Flare of Cultivation in the list is 4. A more reasonable number is likely 5. Because of how powerful many of the lands are, and the colorless cards in Modern Horizons, there is this tension that the design team has tried to create where it wants decks to be punished for running more non-basic lands. So Flare of Cultivation is a way to combat some of that hate against non-basic lands. This also is going to make filter lands a better way to ensure that you have the correct color of mana to cast your double black and double green spells on curve. Which is why I think if Flare of Cultivation is played, you're going to see lists running at least 2 Twilight Mirrors to ensure that your mana is consistent throughout the rest of the game after getting those basics. Once again, because sacrificing a non-token green creature is part of the alternative cost, this once again incentivizes more green Undying creatures. The question you have to ask yourself, Is Yawgmoth enough, or should you be playing some number of Geists as well? Once we introduce Geist into the conversation, more deck building tension arises with regards to our mana base. You also can get punished if your opponent has counter magic and you're trying to cast this for free. Cards that I foresee being a problem for Flare of Cultivation include Flare of Denial, Spell Pierce, and Force of Negation. So these would be cards that I would be playing around if I'm running Flare of Cultivation in my list. In addition to the things I've stated already about this card, this is a card that you want to see in your opening hand. That's when it's going to be the most powerful. So you want to run enough copies to see it early on, but you don't want to run too many copies that you have to severely skew your mana base or find yourself drawing multiples in one game. If you're running 4 copies, I think you would need somewhere between 6 and 7 basics in the deck, which in my opinion would create too many inconsistencies with the mana base. As I mentioned earlier, I think 5 basics is probably the sweet spot for this card, likely 4 forests and 1 swamp. Once again, running more than 1 swamp, you're going to start to have inconsistencies with your mana if you are trying to play out Strangleroot Geist. I foresee 2 to 3 copies of this card being the right number in the deck with 5 basic lands, as I just stated. Sylvan Safekeeper. When this card was initially spoiled, a lot of people got very excited. They viewed it as a tutorable way to protect Yawgmoth, and to be honest, this is an effect that this deck wants. But there's one problem. Sylvan Safekeeper is a human, so you cannot target Yawgmoth with its ability. For this reason, it's only conditionally good because in order to be able to protect Yawgmoth, which is the only card in this deck, or just about the only card in this deck worth protecting, you need to put the Safekeeper under Agatha's Soul Cauldron. But then, if you have a Cauldron in play, couldn't you just let Yawgmoth die and then just put the Yawgmoth under the Cauldron instead? But what if they try to exile Yawgmoth? What I'm trying to get at here is that this card is only good in a very specific situation if you have Cauldron in play and they're trying to exile your Yawgmoth. I will not be playing this card in Black-Green Yawgmoth, and I don't think you should either. Warren Soultrader. This is a card, one of the cards I am most excited for in this set. This is an incredibly powerful card and effect to have access to. There are very few good creatures in Modern that allow you to sacrifice a creature without investing mana into doing so. Some examples include Viscera Seer, Greater Gargadon, Woestrider, and of course, Yawgmoth. Because this card produces an untapped treasure every time you activate its ability, it has combo potential with a Blood Artist effect and a recursive creature. Gravecrawler works, or Samwise and a Cauldron Familiar also works. I think this card will find a home in Modern, but it's probably not going to be in Yawgmoth. However, you better believe I'm going to be testing this card in a bunch of different shells because I think it is super cool and will be very powerful if it finds the right shell. 6. When I first saw this card, it made me laugh because of how much text it had for a 3-mana creature. 6 is an engine type card that plays very well with free spells and has land synergies. So cards like Wrenn 6 and Mishra's Bauble will reward you playing 6. But with that being said, this card requires a significant amount of build around to be as good as possible. Important to note that with Black-Green Yawgmoth, especially the direction the deck is heading in with more Undying creatures and all of these sacrifice effects, many decks are going to be attacking your graveyard post sideboard. And for 6 to be good, you need to have access to your graveyard. So in my opinion, that is a strike against the card. Second, Yawgmoth decks are likely going to be cutting lands if they're running Flare of Cultivation. 6 wants you to be playing more lands to be able to discard for its Retrace ability. This is a second strike against the card in my opinion. This is a very slow and grindy card that requires multiple turns to produce significant amount of value. Notice that 6 does not have an ETB effect, it's only when it attacks. What I've learned over time testing multiple decks and brewing multiple decks is that Modern is a very fast format. Every card needs to apply pressure, impact the board immediately, or be able to interact with the opponent. 6 is a very interesting design, but I think it's more of a fun design than a card that will see play in competitive decks. I will not be playing any copies of 6. Shifting Woodland. There has never been a land that's been printed that has had as unique and powerful effect as Shifting Woodland. The ability to turn your land into a viable threat, in fact, any threat that you want it to be, is one that should not be overlooked and cannot be overstated. This is a very powerful card. With Black-Green Yawgmoth, Delirium should be fairly easy to obtain with fetch lands, a slew of creatures, multiple artifacts, Chord of Calling, Flare of Cultivation, and possibly even Birthing Ritual in the deck. Further, the enters the battlefield tap drawback will matter some percentage of the time, but I think it's going to be a small percentage of the time. The downside of this card is that it's a mono green land, and as I've alluded to earlier, there's not going to be a lot of flexibility with the mana base having additional mono green lands after going up on basic forests with Flare of Cultivation. My personal opinion is that I don't think there will be any mono green sources of mana in the deck besides the basics. If the deck is playing Flare of Cultivation, I don't think you will be able to include this card in the list. If there is no Flare of Cultivation, I could foresee one copy of Shifting Woodland being played in Yawgmoth. Spymaster's Vault. No. This card is just a no. This effect is very conditional. It's a mono black land, as I alluded to before. With the Strangleroot Geist conundrum that you're dealing with, this is just a giant drawback. There's a good chance this is going to enter tapped a large percentage of the time, and there are many other black lands that are just better choices, including one of which we talked about earlier, Phyrexian Tower, Takenuma, and Surveil lands. I think there is no chance this card gets played in Yawgmoth. Lastly, let's look at the uncommons. Marionette Apprentice. This card is super cool in my opinion. It is a card that has immense synergy in the Yawgmoth strategy. It produces an extra body for Chord of Calling, for Birthing Ritual, for Grist -2, and it will also trigger when you sack another creature off Flare of Cultivation. This card's closest comparison is Blood Artist, which Marionette Apprentice on its own is significantly better. It produces 2 points of power, potentially 2 bodies. But the downside is that it doesn't gain life. So on its own, if your life total is lower than your opponent's, you won't be able to combo kill alongside Yawgmoth and Undying creatures. This is a very strong card, but it might not make the cut because of its inability to gain life. Conversely, I could see this card getting played instead of something like Geralf's Messenger as an additional combo option that produces value when it comes into play. I think this card's going to be close to making the cut, but I am leaning in the direction of it's probably not going to. Regardless, I still really like this card. It is very cool and very powerful. Collective Resistance. So we've seen a few similar cards to this in the past. Cards like Atraxa's Fall, Over the Edge, Wilt, Return to Nature, even cards like Terra Sunder, and more recently, Pick Your Poison. Out of all of those cards and the similar effects that they all produce, I'd say this is probably the second or third best of those effects. Its ability to escalate is unique, so you can kill or use more than one mode when you cast this card if you have the mana available. Additionally, its instant speed, which many of these cards are not. Pick Your Poison is not instant speed. As I mentioned earlier, the ability to provide a creature with hexproof and indestructible is one that this deck wants. But alongside the other 2 abilities of this card, Destroy Target Artifact or Destroy Target Enchantment, oftentimes the decks that you would be bringing this in against, that hexproof and indestructible ability isn't going to be super relevant against those decks. And you don't want to be bringing this card in post-sideboard just for one of the abilities. You want to be able to have applications for all of the abilities with this card in matchups that you'd be sideboarding it in. Additionally, Collective Resistance does not get rid of the ring, which is a pretty big drawback and something that you're definitely looking to do with artifact and enchantment removal in the sideboard. For 2 mana, I think that it's likely not going to make the cut. I think Pick Your Poison is probably the better option, at least for now. Boggart Trawler, Boggart Bog. This is the first of 4 different MDFC lands I'm going to be talking about. These lands are very unique in that they can fulfill 2 roles in one card. This one in particular I find to be the most intriguing. The roles that it fills are exiling a graveyard, which Endurance used to fill that role, and it's a black source that can enter play untapped. As you've heard me talk about throughout the course of this video, there are a lot of cards that are competing for main deck slots in Yawgmoth. And for that reason, this card becomes very appealing. You can slot this card in instead of Endurance, which it's slightly worse than on its front side, but it also fills the role of a land, which opens up a slot for another card in the deck. I will say that the land side of this would be significantly better if it was a green source. So the fact that it does not produce green is a significant drawback, and Yawgmoth's biggest asset, or one of its biggest resources, is life total, and if we want to put this into play untapped, it will deal us damage. So you have to ask yourself, are the two drawbacks I just mentioned worth being able to include an extra card in the deck? I think it's close, but I think the answer is yes. I will likely be testing and playing one copy of this card. There are two other MDFC lands that come into play untapped that I would consider for Yawgmoth. Fell the Profane Fellmire, Disciple of Freyalise, Garden of Freyalise. Both these cards are very strong. However, I think they have less utility for our deck than Boggart Trawler. There's only so many of these cards and these effects that you can play in a deck like Yawgmoth and feel good doing so. And the fact that Boggart Trawler is an effect that we're already playing, to me says that we will likely be going with the Trawler rather than these two other options. The last of the MDFC lands that I wanted to talk about is Revitalizing Repast Old Growth Grove. This one produces 2 colors of mana and potentially produce the hexproof effect that I described earlier, but I just don't think the deck can afford to play more tapped lands. And for that reason, I don't foresee this card making the cut. So that does it with my Modern Horizons 3 set recap for Black-Green Yawgmoth. This is a powerful set with lots of exciting tools and options for the Yawgmoth archetype. And I think the inclusion of these new cards will create some very interesting and complicated deck building challenges. Specifically, how do you construct the mana base? How many Undying creatures, and which ones are you going to play? I think the answer to these 2 questions will largely dictate which new cards you can and will play, and what direction the deck goes in. In my opinion, these 2 considerations are being overlooked when people are talking about certain cards, and they're being underestimated by many people who are discussing future builds of the deck. Ultimately, time will tell. Am I wrong? Am I right? We'll see. I am very eager to get to testing to find out. Be sure to head over to my Patreon to become a part of an enthusiastic growing community of over 500 Yawgmoth players. I'll be posting regular deck updates and sideboard guides after Modern Horizons 3 is released, so definitely check that out. Thank you for tuning in. Happy brewing, and until next time, you know the deal. Be well, my friend.